Good evening, everybody.
Greetings.
We've got a beauty for you guys.
Yeah. One that required a little bit of thought on everybody's part.
So, I just read a message up on the sidebar. I don't know if you see it too, Mark, but it says this hangout is on air live, and then it's a blue square, and then below it says hangout on air is going away later this year for quick streaming by youtube.com webcam.
Okay, yeah, we're going to have to check into that. This may be intriguing.
That just
No,
blew my mind.
I don't see it because I'm not the one that started this.
Hangout, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, it's in blue.
I don't see it at all.
Yeah. I'm not going to unclick it because I want you to see it later.
Okay.
We'll screen capture something to that effect.
Okay. Well, now that everybody knows our dirty laundry. So, what's going on this week in the wonderful world of Trampled Underfoot podcast?
Well, seeing as last week we did what you call our top 10 all-time favorite albums, we were sort of tossing around the idea of what about the worst albums out there? If the top 10 best was difficult for us to collate and decide on because there's so much goodness out there, it's kind of even as rough to figure on the worst albums. I mean, maybe you have a different thought on that.
Well, when you approached me with it, my first thought was, man, that's going to be hard. Because basically what I based buying an album off of was two things. If I like the group, then I can pretty much count on I'm going to like the album. Like I don't think the Beatles made a bad album. I don't think Stevie Ray Vaughan made a bad album. I don't think Jimi Hendrix made a bad album. But I like them. I like their style. I like their music. But when you kind of start getting into groups that are maybe new to you or unknown to you, and when I go out and buy an album by a band I don't know, you can basically be guaranteed that I like at least one song on that album. Otherwise, why buy it? So I couldn't come up with albums except one that I absolutely hated. But I came up with one that I hate and two that were major disappointments. They both have a song on it that I like, but they were major disappointments and I should have just saved my money.
Well, for me, it was pretty tough because when you buy an album, especially back in the day, it's like, boy, I spent this money and it's not coming back to me. And I've got this album and I just listened to it. And I don't like these songs. Well, I mean, but that one I can kind of deal with. You force yourself to like it because you have to.
Yeah,
bought it. You bought it. So that's how it was back in the day. Whereas now, obviously, you can, hear whatever you want. But
yeah. And when I started buying albums, you got to remember back, this was, I got like a $5 a week allowance. And that's what an album costs. So that was my whole allowance that went to buy that record album. So, when you got home and there was major buyer's remorse, you were like, man, I mowed how many lawns for this? Took out the trash and did this and that and the other. So
I don't even know what's so comforting because we reminisce about what you call the limitations we used to have. We reminisce on these limitations and look back on them with fondness. And it's kind of a weird thing to do so. Maybe not, but it is in considering that now the options are just wild. I mean, we could listen to, what do you want? Rush, 2112 right now on demand. Let's do it. What do you want? Jimi Hendrix first. And it's kind of weird. it's kind of weird that we look back in fondness of limitations, but I think
Right.
there's something to be said about limitations because you have to spend more intimate time with the things that you have. You get more out of them because you simply don't have access to, you
Right.
know.
I agree 100%. I liken it to taking a picture. Okay. It back in the day when you had your camera and you had 12 or 24, maybe 36 pictures on a roll of film. So
Yeah.
you were already into the roll of film for a few bucks. Then you had to take it in and have it processed. And you got your prints back. And you didn't know what you got on that roll of film until you got it back. You had no idea what you had. So
Yep.
you were a lot more selective about what you took a picture of. And you made sure everything was just right before you ever hit that button because that button cost you money. And now with digital photography, you can take 13 pictures of the same thing and go through and eliminate 12, and I'm going to keep that one. You couldn't do that before. Professionals could, and they did. They would burn through film like it was, nothing.
I
But
don't.
it was the same way with music. Now, if you got a new group, you can go listen to a couple of their songs online. Yeah, I don't like them, and then forget it.
I,
There's no buyer's remorse involved.
I don't. I don't know how to. You talking about the process of pictures? It's
Uh-huh.
something that I haven't dealt with since the days of yesteryear. Um, I I'm gonna say it anyhow, but so people, I hate to say it, but people would have to have these roles developed at back then, like let's say Eckerd Drugs,
Mhm.
right, which is now CBS or CVS, or photo boot shops or whatnot.
Yep.
And but so people would take dirty pictures and leave the rolls, and they'd be popping out of the machine, and you'd get all sort. And the reason I'm saying that is that conversely, I mean, because I remember this vividly. So there, what I'm trying to get at is there's a lot of power behind that Eckerd Drugs booth where the technician, because people were just completely okay with developing their nudie pics. I worked at Kinko's, and people would
Yeah.
print and leave all sorts of debauchery
Oh yeah.
on the yeah.
Oh
And
yeah.
when you were saying that, it reminded me of that. It's one of those things that you talk about privacy nowadays,
Hmm.
and people, and the lack of or whatnot. Um, well, people back then had the option of not revealing all this stuff, and there'd be nudie pictures flying out
Yeah.
the freaking machine.
There was more than one. It's funny you're talking about this absolute subject or this specific subject because a few years back, when I worked in a casino, one of my regular customers, she ran the photo counter at a grocery store, and she said she had all kinds of stories to tell about pictures that she developed. You know, and there was more than one technician, I guess you'd call them,
Yeah,
that processed the film that got fired for making their own copies of that kind of thing.
yeah,
They'd make extra copies and take them home.
yeah.
You know,
Because some
so
photos are just too good not to make a copy of. I mean,
ah,
well,
so
but
you know,
I mean, but think of the point of people back then. Um, Heck, here's a roll of us having a great old time, honey. I'm gonna go develop the okay, darling, and then they're popping out of a machine that's in public, being processed by people that you have no idea. Just the whole concept of it, and believe you me, um, that was a common thing for those of you that don't know.
yeah, it was very common. Now we got off onto that subject away, totally away from music. We can go back to it, but that's that. Yeah, but that's what I relate buying an album to back then. Was if you're buying an album for one song, the rest of that album was an unknown quantity to you. You had no idea what it was. And once you spent the money on it, that was it. It was yours. You couldn't take it back because you didn't like it.
Right.
You know, it had to be some kind of damage to it. It had to have been a damaged record, and then they would exchange it, but they would no cash refunds. At least none of the record stores I went to.
Well, and then you'd have the cover to make your judgment by, or you have friends that would suggest the band or mention it in passing, and you're at the mall and you're like looking at the shelves full of cassette tapes, for example, and you're looking at album covers, and then you run across and you say, okay, we're going to try this. There was a lot of albums that I tried. Rush, my first Rush album was Presto, which was their 1980s. That's when they busted out with a bunch of keyboards and electronic sounds.
Yeah.
A lot of Rush fans weren't too keen on that one.
A lot of people did not like that. They liked the old one guitar, one bass, and drums.
Well, I see. Here's the problem. I dug that album fiercely. Could it be because I spent $10 on it, and
Well, no, it was a good album.
I think it was.
The purists didn't like that album because of the keyboards.
Yeah.
But then again, that worked for them because they were still Rush and all the music was still them. But it wasn't like the Doobie Brothers when they moved away from the guitar-based rock and roll with Tom Johnson as lead singer and got into the keyboard-based with Michael McDonald. That was Doobie Brothers went way downhill. As far as I was concerned, I didn't like them anymore.
Yeah, they were always very good at mixing a very high fidelity, regardless of the transition of the changes, but that band did have a very high end recording output. Like it sounded like you could reach into the headphones and hold on to the bass and the instruments. I don't know. It's just a very high end sound that they had for some reason.
Yeah.
Compared to other bands that there's grit and stuff. It sounds a little bit further to reach. They had this very clear, crisp sound. I don't know. That's my impression of them. But
So we keep talking about the best and stuff that we like. I don't know who you want to go first. We each basically, for the audience at large here, we each picked 3 albums that we didn't like.
That's right.
Now, let me ask this. Are these albums that we personally bought and owned?
So I have. So the answer to that question is one of them, yes, and 2 of them, no, in my case. And the reason being is that, number one, this is a very difficult thing to do. We're going to list 5 of our worst albums.
5? I thought you said 3.
Oh, no, wait, 6.
Yeah, our top 6.
Our top 6, that's right. So let me correct that.
Or bottom 6.
Well, Mark is doing 3. Yeah, is it our top? These are the bottom 6, all-time bottom 6 albums that we just simply have to categorize as the worst. And it's an unfortunate thing to have to put a music fan, music lover through, because you can find even the best of things in a not so good album.
Yep.
So it's a difficult one, Mark.
Yep. One of them was super easy for me, but the other 2, I had to think about them a bit.
Okay.
So, you want to go first? Do you want me to go first? I don't care.
You go first.
Okay. I'm going to get real controversial from the get-go.
No, from the gecko.
From the gecko. That's right. From the gecko. Call back.
Yeah.
The right people will get it. And this is a band otherwise I like. But this album just to me stunk. And like I say, I bought every album that I ever bought and owned. I bought because I liked at least one song. And this is illustration of it, and that was Grand Funk Railroad, All the Girls in the World Beware.
Okay.
That was a huge disappointment for me. It had Some Kind of Wonderful on it, and that was why I bought that album.
Okay.
The rest of that album was an absolute stinker.
The
I
whole rest of it?
I did not like another single tune on there. I thought, what the hell is this?
That bad.
It was that bad, in my opinion. And there's a reason why you never heard of any of the other songs on that album. The only one that was worth a ding dong was Some Kind of Wonderful. And if I would have known that going in, I would have just bought the single and been happy with it. Because the version on the album was exactly the same as the version on the single. Same running time, same everything. It stunk. In my opinion. Yeah.
Well, I mean,
and normally I liked Grand Funk. I had a couple of their albums. But that one was really bad.
oh wow. Do you think that what did it sound patched together and just to sell the main song and then everything was patched into it so that they could sell an LP?
Well, it came out in December of 74, late 74, not quite 75. And they went on a huge tour in 75, starting in January. And they played a few tunes from this album, but it didn't really work out. Now, the album before this, Shining On, was a good album. And then the one after this, Caught in the Act, was a good album as well. But this one, for some reason, it was real poppy. The songs were kind of the producer was the same guy that produced the Bay City Rollers, the Raspberries, and Three Dog Night. So,
yeah,
Three Dog Night was pretty poppy. They had some good music. They had some meh. The Raspberries, meh. The Bay City Rollers are the definition of bubblegum pop. Okay. And this album, it was a lot of it. It really felt a lot of bubblegum to it. Almost like they were in it for the cash and that was it.
right.
So it's probably my least favorite Grand Funk album and one of the all-time worst albums that I've ever bought.
Did you come to the so where did you buy it? At your local record? I mean, where?
Yeah, my local record shop. At this time, I talked about it last week. This was at Banana Records in Fremont, California.
Okay, we've brought that subject up before.
Several times, yeah. In fact, no, that was the only one that I bought there. The other two I bought up here at various places.
So once you put that record on, and did you hear the first? I mean, did you hear the what was the track again? The popular one
was Some Kind of Wonderful.
She's some kind of wonderful.
Exactly, and I believe I just closed it. That was the last song on the album. Yes, that was track 10 of 10. That was the last song on side 2.
So they made you suffer through. So when you put on the thing and you heard the first one, you're like, "What the hell?" And it got
yeah.
And then at the end they give you like a release.
Yeah, basically. I mean, everybody has. I mean, you can buy an album and maybe you like half of the songs.
Yeah.
Maybe you like all of the songs. Maybe you like 3 or 4. Maybe you like the majority of them. But everybody's got that one song that they bought the album for. And this was the only song that had any kind of redeeming value to it. To me, it really was their worst effort.
Okay.
So
that
was my number 3. What's your number 3?
My number 3 is The Final Countdown by Europe.
Wow.
Now, have you heard that album?
I've not heard the album, but I know the song.
Okay, so you know the song goes doo 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 doo. It sounds minstrel.
Right.
It sounds just electronic. It was an 80s sort of. Here's the thing. Back in the day, and they had this on MTV all the time, and that little trumpety keyboard just pissed me off to no end. That little every time it would come up, we'd be hanging out, me and my friend Ernie and others, and we'd be kicking back, and then we'd hear doo-doo-doo-doo, doo-doo-doo-doo-doo, and it just sounded so corny to us back then. And so because rock and roll heavy metal was dark, and we had the death metal and the heavy metal going on, and we're like into the and then here comes this hair metal band, and they look so just like they can just snap with the wind because they're so feeble.
I, I
um
I think the word you're looking for is ridiculous.
yeah, they but they also, I mean, these are guys, but they are the just extreme of like makeup, but in such, and plus the music attached to it, they sounded ridiculous. It was corny beyond belief. And here's the kicker. I didn't own this album, but the reason I picked it was because I just don't did not like, and their posters, everything was purple and it's sloshy, and it looked like a Slurpee that had fallen on the ground. The machine was toppled over and all the Slurpee colors mixed. So we had a friend, and we would go visit his house, and lo and behold, he had the huge poster of Europe, and he was so into, he loved the band Europe, and we thought it was why would you love that, dude? And we would ask him why, and like he never gave us. He just liked it. He was firm on liking the band Europe, and we were like, dude. So very corny, and so I picked that one. It's it's just one of those things.
That was a now it's funny. I'm looking up the album here. Um, they released 5 singles from that album. I have heard of one, and that was The Final Countdown.
Yeah.
That's the only song of theirs I've ever heard of.
Well, you know, it's an unfortunate thing, but I my friend, well, it's not unfortunate, good for you. I'm just saying it's unfortunate that they were so, it's too much, dude. Like, considering the era and us kids growing up, with the Metallicas at that time,
Yeah.
there was a rawness, and we were okay with the hair metal and glam, but
Mhm.
you had people like Whitesnake, right? They're a little bit glammed out, but here we go again on our own,
Yeah.
and they're like,
White Snake. Yeah.
yeah, there's a little bit of, they've got some,
Mhm.
and these people are
Yeah.
like, "Biddy-dee-bee, biddy-dee-bee." It sounded like frolicking in the woods. So yeah. So what's your number two?
Okay, so now I don't own that album, The Final Countdown. I've never owned the album. It came out in '86. I was into blues by then and really wasn't paying much attention to popular music unless something really caught my ear, and that just wasn't one of them. So, okay, I'm going to cheese a few people off with this one, I think. But my second least favorite album, and I count it as one of the worst I've ever bought, was Joan Jett and the Blackhearts' I Love Rock and Roll. Uh-oh, I lost Eloy. Where did he go? Not that button. I'll wait for him to come back. Let's see if I can fill in while he's gone. He didn't hear it. Y'all pretend like you didn't hear it. Oh, man. Don't know what happened. He typed in. There he is. He's back.
I just
Not,
pressed
not that
the
button.
wrong. Yeah, sorry about that.
You
Go
okay?
on.
Okay, so thought maybe you heard my choice and decided you were leaving.
No.
My choice was Joan Jett and the Blackhearts' I Love Rock and Roll.
No.
Yes.
No, Mark,
Yes.
I cannot accept this.
Nope. I bought it again. She was an unknown quantity to me. She's a good guitarist, but that particular album, the only song worth the ding dong to me was I Love Rock and Roll, and everything else was just a load of tripe to me. It was a bunch of crap,
Okay,
as
so I've
far as
not.
I'm concerned.
All right, I'm sorry. I'm shocked. That one did shock me because I've not heard the whole album. And to be frank, I'm
Okay.
yeah. To be frank, that's the title song to me is just so classic rock and roll. But you're saying that
And you're right about that song. I
okay,
still like it. I've got it on my iTunes. I've got the MP3. But when I bought that album and put it on and I heard the rest of that album, I was like, what the hell is this?
wow.
Now, she was kind of, sort of, almost, but not quite a little punk in
Hmm.
it in some of the tunes, but very poppy. And just, it was like they were trying too hard and missed it by that much. There was, like I said, the only song on there, that was worth a ding dong to me was I Love Rock and Roll. And the rest of it was completely 100% forgettable.
Well, what were the other songs?
They did do a fairly decent cover of Crimson and Clover.
Oh, okay, so that's on there. So,
Right,
that is a pretty decent cover
right.
of Crimson. I liked
Yes.
it,
It
but
wa it wasn't bad. It wasn't bad.
so what other song?
Well, let's see. They had Bits and Pieces, Be Straight, Victim of Circumstance. I'm reading off the track list here.
Mhm.
The one that I absolutely despised was called Nag. And there was, to me, it was like, yeah, fine. I was very much a purist when it comes to my record albums. You put the needle in the groove at the
Yeah.
start of the album, and you don't pick it up. You don't hopscotch through my record albums.
If you have to do that,
You you
we,
you don't do that on my albums.
but if it's
That album was the only exception.
we have a problem, Houston. Skip the needle to the next track.
And in fact, I recorded those two tunes, Crimson and Clover and I Love Rock and Roll. I put them on cassette and then put the album back in the cover and didn't pull it out again. I don't think, maybe once or twice.
Wow.
But no, it was just no. I don't like it. Didn't like it, and really wished I could have had that money back. It was released in '81. And I really did like I Love Rock and Roll. I liked the guitars, and I thought, man, she's really got something going on.
Yeah, totally.
And I was the same way with Pat Benatar. That first song that I ever heard from her, Heartbreaker, I loved that song. And I thought she really has this going on. Then she went really seriously pop on a couple of other tunes, and it just was not my cup of tea. But I didn't buy her album. I did buy Joan Jett's album, and I will never make that mistake again.
Wow. So my number 2, right?
Yeah.
Back in the 80s, I'm younger than you are. I'm coming up, in the 80s, and I have friends in my area, and there's a lot of music. We're little kids, preteens, and we have older brothers of all of us that have all this rock and roll records and posters, and we get fed down the rock and roll, and we'd listen from there, and then we would emulate them. They had the tattoos and the long hair and the earrings and just the whole nine leather, the whole 9 yards. And they had honest to goodness girlfriends, and we were like, wow, these people are for real. They were the brothers.
Right.
So by the time the 80s come, the end of the 80s, I think, let me make sure. I mean, let me make sure when this came out. So actually in 93. So there was a band called Megadeth, and I liked Megadeth in the 80s. They were hard rock. The lead singer left Metallica, Dave Mustaine. He was the lead guitarist of Metallica pre Kirk Hammett, and I loved Metallica. They have their own monster creature, Megadeth does, and they have bad to the bone heavy metal, just really kick butt. And then they came out in 1993, going forward in time, with the album Countdown to Extinction.
Okay.
And the thing about that is that they played these on MTV all the time, and their offering for the single was a song called Sweating Bullets. And I hated that song because in the video, he would take his hand like a puppet, like kind of The Shining,
Mhm.
where the little kid has a puppet and he says, "Hello, how you doing?" He had his little
Right.
imagine. Well, Dave Mustaine says he's sitting in a cell and he talks to himself and he says, "Hello, me. Meet the real me." It was so corny that he was doing sort of an acting thing, and the song, he rocks it, but that was so corny amongst our friends that it actually dropped Megadeth down a lot of notches in the heavy metal, in our little heavy metal community. So there's not much to it other than that. And this has been a hard thing to choose the worst but that was so corny as well that I just couldn't see a freaking bad to the bone rock and roll lead guitarist. He's sitting in the MTV video in a jail cell with a little puppet thing, and he's pointing at himself as if he's got schizophrenia.
Mhm.
And that whole thing was just a total music turnoff to me and my buddies.
Yeah.
So that was mine.
Now, I've never heard the album, and that's not my genre of music. I'm not a serious metalhead. I like hard rock, but I'm not a serious metalhead. So when people start talking to me about, metal groups and things like that, I'm out of my element. I'm lost.
Yeah.
I'm like your buddies back in the day. There he goes, bringing the blues in again. Well, I'm like, there they go, bringing the metal in again. There's more than 4 chords, y'all. That kind of shit. So did I say that? I said that. So
You see, see how this,
yeah, because I get passionate about this kind of stuff, man.
I don't want to drag it out. We should just let it sweep under the rug.
We're going to
Okay.
pretend it never happened. Deep
When
breath.
you're
All better.
comfortable, you're comfortable. You just let it roll, baby.
Mhm. Deep breath. All better. Bad man, go away. Okay.
You took the heat off of me though from last week. I'll tell you what.
Yeah, well, those who listen to the podcast this week know that I cleaned it up, but that's cool. So we're at to my third one, right?
Yep.
Okay, before I name my third one, I'm going to make a casual observation. It appears to me that the two that you're talking about, two that you've mentioned so far, were albums that you didn't like based on one song.
Yes.
And that's legit. That's totally legit to me. I bought the albums for one song and then didn't like the rest of the album.
Right.
So
Yep.
there was still something there that was a little worthwhile to me. But this last album, I can say right now, this was the easy one, because the minute you said worst albums, boom, that title came to mind, because I can seriously say I don't like anything on the album.
Okay.
And that is the soundtrack to the movie Saturday Night Fever.
Oh wow.
And the only reason I owned the album was because my ex-wife, my wife at the time, loved it. She liked the movie. She loved that style of music. And so you got to make the love in your life happy. You buy it and you play it.
So I could picture you sitting back listening to dun 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 dun.
No, it was
Dun, 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 dun.
in the car. We had the cassette. We did
I
not
can
have the
picture
record album.
I could picture you driving down the highway. Dun, 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 dun.
Yeah,
Dun, dun,
that
dun, dun.
song, I don't think that song was on it.
It
But
is.
it was.
It's
Is it? Okay.
Yeah, on Saturday Night Fever.
My problem with the Saturday Night Fever album can be traced down to two words. And those two words are Bee Gees. I cannot express my true feelings toward the Bee Gees in public. But I can tell you right here and now that the machine has not yet been invented that can measure how much I hate this album. And it got played in my car from the time it came out until the time I went into the army and the tape came up missing.
So wait a second. The song I'm mentioning, because it's such a in your face sort of thing, is Beethoven's Fifth,
Yeah, that was
and it is.
Fifth of Beethoven. Was that on that album?
Yep.
Okay. Well, like I said, it and it would. I think it probably would have been okay if those would have played in the car, but mainly what got played in the car was the Bee Gees.
Yeah, but wait a second. You don't like how deep is your
I don't need a reprise. No, I don't.
How about More Than a Woman by the Bee
And
Gees? More
no,
than a woman. Come
no.
on.
And here's the thing, and it's sad because years ago, when you go back to the 60s, I actually did like the Bee Gees. They were kind of down the rung, but some of their stuff, the night the lights went out in Massachusetts,
Yeah.
How Do You Mend a Broken Heart, things like that. I mean, those were good songs. I could listen to that. That could come on the radio and I'd be like, oh yeah, I remember that. Okay, cool. But after that movie and that soundtrack came out, and they came out with that falsetto, and don't get me wrong, those guys are the kings of harmony. They sing well together. But after 4 years of listening to nothing but, I can truly say with a smile on my face that I detest that album and everything the Bee Gees came to represent.
Okay, so I can totally go ahead. I can totally see.
But I don't mean that in a bad way.
Right.
Oh, yes, I do.
Well, no, but wait a second. You don't like Casey and the Sunshine Band? They're from Florida, man. They had a song on there.
And you know what? I blame Florida for this.
Oh, because they lived in Florida too.
Well, the Bee Gees went and started recording disco in Florida.
Yeah, at Criteria Records, I think.
At the suggestion of Eric Clapton, of all things.
Oh, I didn't know that bit.
Now, maybe that was a joke. Yeah, why don't you go to Florida and record disco music? Maybe it was a joke.
But
but the flippin' kids ran with it. All right.
Well, it bursted open a whole wave of dress up, and the whole thing. But I don't. Okay, so look, I for heavy metal and rock and roll purists, disco was a problem, to say the least.
Well, you're more diplomatic than me because I call it a dark time in American music history.
I mean, so look, I can look back in fondness. Mm-hmm. I really can. Now,
at that album?
Oh, that album I totally like, dude. The Beach. Okay, look,
enjoy it.
I could not. No, but wait a sec. I could not sit. Like you said, in your car, and that's the record that's always on and on. That would drive me insane. I totally am with you. But as an album to listen to and just one time, and I can totally accept that.
I would go driving by myself on occasion just so I could play something else.
Man.
Throw on some, Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, anything, let's just clear my mind, get rid of the Bee Gees,
It's a tough one. It is. I totally understand it, dude. I can't, I'm just not that, uh like against it, but I can totally see how one could be. Okay, so here's my number. That was your number 3, yeah?
That's my number one worst album.
Okay, so my number 1 worst album I left for number 1 is one that I did buy. And it's an unfortunate one because I like the artist and I like all the songs on that album. Every last one of them, except I don't like that album. And the album is Bob Dylan live at Budokan.
Okay.
I love all the songs because all of them are just fantastic rock and roll writing, lyrical, just the whole thing. But the recording, the sort of that arena ambiance, Bob Dylan's performance is a lot left to be. When you listen to that album, you can hear glimpses of what the songs could be. And when I bought that album, because it was on sale, and I said, "Boy, this is Bob Dylan, and it's on sale," so I bought it back in the '80s. I'm a little kid. I just bought it because I said, "Bob Dylan, hell, I take it home." And I didn't. I think that was my first live album I ever bought,
Mhm.
and I didn't know that live albums have an honest to goodness live sound. Well, boy, that ruined the whole vibe of the thing.
Yeah.
Um, and you could hear glimpses of "I Shall Be Released" and all the songs. You could hear the melodies, and I had to, in my mind, sort of picture what I actually would think. Man, these would make good songs if they were well recorded. And so that
Yeah.
is my worst choice, and it's unfortunate because I love Bob Dylan music.
I'm with you. I haven't listened to the whole album, but I've heard cuts from it, and hearing those cuts, I wouldn't buy it. And it's been, I've heard some of Bob Dylan's other live stuff here and there, like some cuts off of Concert for Bangladesh,
Yeah,
George Harrison, and what have you. And Bob Dylan live is it's kind of a crapshoot. You may get an excellent performance, and you may get a mediocre performance, and may get a really bad performance. It just depends on what he's doing that day. What the
yeah.
mood is, how the voice is going. And he's kind of that way on his albums too. He has a good voice when he wants to. If you listen to something like Lay Lady Lay or Knocking on Heaven's Door, he has a good balladier's voice. He has a good storyteller's voice. But then you hear something like Subterranean Homesick Blues or How Does It Feel? And it's a completely different voice.
Let me just say something about that. There.
And
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
well, what I was going to say was, so when you go to a Dylan concert and you listen to a live performance, you don't know what you're going to get because it may be none of the above.
Yeah, that is
It's just
correct.
going to depend. I mean, his voice can drop way low
So
and do everything in monotone, and other times he's real expressive. So, it just depends.
I'll say this. So I owned 2 volumes, paperback but thick,
Hmm.
of all of Bob Dylan's analysis of all his music and recordings that are bootlegs.
Hmm.
A lot of people may not know that just like the Grateful Dead, Bob Dylan did recordings on just about everything that he had ever done. And through interviews, and whether recorded audio or not, written interviews, sit downs throughout his career, it is suggested that he is intentionally switching his performances of each song so they're virtually never the same.
Yeah. I've heard that
because
same
yeah, because he has a notion that um just he's a different character, which is what makes him Bob Dylan. But so you never hear, and it can go from really the classic sound to a nightmare to listen to.
thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
And there was one exception to that rule, because you're right. He did switch things up and change things around, always constantly changing. And there was one exception to that. And he said, and I don't remember which interview this was, when he heard Hendrix's version of All Along the Watchtower, he tried to do it that way ever since. He absolutely loved Hendrix's cover of All Along the Watchtower. So he tried to pick up the tempo and play it that way every time.
So another thing of Bob Dylan is that I got to see him.
I did too.
Maybe I would say about 2014, 2013, I got to see him. He was up in West Palm Beach, and he was on the ticket with like a whole host of different bands, up and coming bands, and he was the headliner at the end of the night. But because of the climate of music and whatnot, Bob Dylan is from an era from back in the 60s that came from folk music and progressed into, this variant rock and roll, folk rock and roll, whatever you might want to call it.
Mhm.
And so maybe not so popular nowadays with people coming up, young people. Not true 100% of the time, but judging by just searching on YouTube with music and whatnot, you can kind of sort of place where the old rock and rollers are valued at nowadays. And I went to that concert to see him.
Yeah.
And when I got in there, it's an amphitheater. It's called the Cruzian Amphitheater, and it has rolling hills, man-made because it's Florida, that swoop down, and then the amphitheater is on the bottom, and people sit on the green and smoke up, drink up, all the good stuff, like the typical thing. And we could not even we were sitting so far away up on the hill, and they had all the cool bands playing, and they had a lot of instrumentation, this and that. As the night, wrapped up, Bob Dylan jumped on, and everybody left except for a few seats in the front, and he's the headliner. I
Oh,
was
geez.
able to, yeah, I was able to walk down to the front of inside the front of the amphitheater, like there's the green, there's a little sidewalk, and then there's the amphitheater and the seating inside the amphitheater.
Right.
Um, and the guard just let me walk in because there's nobody there. And I went and sat like in the third row. The first two rows were full,
Mhm.
but everybody else was just like, and there was one straggler here and there. I got to
Wow.
sit and watch Bob Dylan perform like 6 or 7 songs before my friends, which were drunk somewhere else, came to me and said, "Hey, dude, come on, like, let's go." I said, "Dude, we're sitting in front of Bob Dylan, listening to him play all the songs." And they're like, "Yeah, yeah, let's go." Like they were there for I was there for to see this guy. He's standing right there. And by the way, none of the songs sounded. You could hear that they were the songs that we all know and love, but none of them sounded the same. It was like, what the hell? But
Yep.
regardless, I was like, well, heck, this is Bob Dylan right there.
Yep. I had a similar experience with a concert over in Hawaii. It was Joe Walsh opened for, well, it was Eddie Money, Joe Walsh, and the Doobie Brothers. I skipped Eddie Money, got there, listened to Joe Walsh, and then split before the Doobie Brothers came on. So, and
Wow.
I wasn't the only one. It was a good percentage. I was there to see Joe Walsh, and that was it. I saw Dylan and Tom Petty in Reno in 1986. And it was Tom Petty and Bob Dylan, and they played together, did a bunch of tunes together. And it was June of 86 because it was just before I went back into the Army. I went back into the Army in October, that October. And that was the last concert I went to before I went. And it was a very good concert. But again, I think Tom Petty more or less kept Dylan. The Dylan songs that they played, like Ramona to Ramona. Um, um, let's see. God, I'm trying to positively Fourth Street. I'm trying to think of what other songs that they played. Rainy Day Women. Um, More or less, Tom Petty kept Dylan on track
Yeah.
because they sounded like the songs that you had heard on albums or on the radio.
Yeah.
There wasn't a lot of changing up. There was some, because you're not talking about just Dylan out there with a guitar and maybe a drummer and a bassist. You're talking about Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers with Bob Dylan out there. So they had a whole band, and it was a very good performance. It was a very good concert.
I think that, so just as a recommendation for folks, either listening live now, or in the future, whenever, I'll just say that if you've not heard of Bob Dylan, he's a musician that, boy, he came up playing acoustic guitar. He was a big fan of the folk music that came, into fashion, I guess, as the 50s turned into the 60s. You had people
Yeah,
like Arlo Guthrie, or Woody Guthrie, forgive me,
yeah,
and his son later, Arlo, but that changed things up a little bit. But you had people like Woody Guthrie and all this, and he kind of like was, um, in fact, he did a pilgrimage to Woody Guthrie, traveling, searching him out, and he found him on his deathbed. Just about, there's a whole story about that. There might be pictures. I think there's pictures on the internet. And Bob Dylan, a lot of his early friends, it's kind of a little bit like Robert Johnson going to the crossroads, and people that knew him, he went to the crossroads and they thought, Robert Johnson, he's not a talented, he's not. And when he returned from the crossroads, Robert Johnson was an incredible musician all of a sudden. That's the legend.
yeah.
Bob Dylan, there's actually that legend as well with Bob Dylan, because he was a piano player before he was anything else, believe it or not. And in fact, he wrote a lot of his songs on
On
piano,
piano,
like
yeah, I did know that.
a Rolling Stone, and all that. But he he appeared on the New York scene playing a bunch of songs, and he started to write his music as opposed to copy other people's stuff, but using the musical structures. And people would see him playing in New York. What's that place? The Village,
Yeah,
the Village,
Greenwich
right?
Village, Greenwich Village. Yeah,
And they would hear music attached to new lyrics, and it began to blow people's minds,
yeah,
blow his minds, because what he was doing, the importance of Bob Dylan is that he took Americana, folk music, and he continued the tradition in the current state of affairs that life in America was at, on a political level, on a struggle level, the whole hippie era, all that stuff. And he put it down on, on pen and paper, and then music. And he continued a tradition of folk music, writing protest songs and this and that. But he injected a level of poetry that was unknown up until then in music. And so that's the importance of Bob Dylan, and it reaches so much further than that, that you can ask many musicians, regardless of his voice and this and that, because a lot of people criticize him. You can see a lot of musicians point to Bob Dylan and his songwriting,
right,
including Tom Petty, as their inspiration, because it's
right.
just remarkable. And the last thing I'll say about this is that I would recommend, for anybody that's never heard Bob Dylan, or that has but was like, because they heard the later stuff, which I'm not opposed to, but is his second album, which
Right.
was, what's the one with the him on the cover with his girlfriend walking
It's
down?
Freewheeling Bob Dylan.
That album I recommend so much because it's just him and his guitar,
Hmm.
and it is his best vocal performance in my opinion, and his strongest. It's an intimate album with him and the acoustic. You put on headphones, you listen to that, and you listen to him tell the stories that he was singing about, and it's quite the experience. So I recommend that album.
Yeah. And in fact, that's the one that launched him. His first album, just self-titled Bob Dylan, didn't do very well at all, but he played a bunch of just straight folk songs. Some were his, some were not his. Um, and it was the freewheeling Bob Dylan. He kind of
Yeah.
broke out of that folk singer mold. Not quite, but he was a lot more open, a lot more expressive, and a lot more Bob Dylan, and less with doing traditional folk tunes. That's the one that broke him out. And as far as his importance as a songwriter, I can remember as a kid, even if you've never heard Bob Dylan before, you have heard a Bob Dylan song. The man was a prolific songwriter, and he wrote for more than just himself. And I remember as a kid, you could not go a half hour on the radio without hearing either Bob Dylan or somebody else singing a song Bob Dylan wrote, because he wrote songs for everybody. And people went to him begging to cover his tunes. Everybody from the Byrds with Mr. Tambourine Man to Hendrix with All Along the Watchtower. Um, they were all over the place. He was a very, very prolific songwriter. And even he could never record all of the songs he wrote. Even just little bits and pieces, and a line would come to him and he would write it down, and it may turn into something, it may not. It may be included in something he thought he had finished and then didn't finish. But the man wrote more music than even he could ever have recorded.
The Beatles, something that you would not even consider attached to Bob Dylan, were huge fans of Dylan,
Mhm.
and you could hear it in a lot of the songs some of the songs that the Beatles played, such as, what's that one? I once had a girl, or should I say, she once had me.
Yep.
Um,
Norwegian Wood.
Norwegian Wood is a total Bob Dylan, John Lennon doing Bob Dylan. It's total, and it's admitted as much. Um, so it reached even up into the high ranks of rock and roll royalty, like the Beatles.
Mhm.
It's just an amazing thing.
Yeah.
Now, people did sort of the folk community. Bob Dylan's whole story is actually, it's kind of like Jim Morrison in a way, because there's a thing that happened in the 60s, which is to me the most special time in rock and roll pop music, because a lot of traditional ways of producing music on every level, from writing to performing to recording, was expanded. um and so Bob Dylan decided to go electric because he in turn was inspired by the Beatles. Well, his fans weren't too happy about that.
Oh,
And,
yeah.
right?
Started a riot. I don't remember which folk festival it
Newport.
was. Was it Newport?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. He came out with with a Stratocaster
Yep.
and sat down, and they were just, you cannot play folk music on an electric guitar. And just, holy cow.
He
You
was
know.
booed. You can find that
Yep.
performance on YouTube,
Hmm.
and he's booed throughout the whole thing, and they just went at it and went at it.
Yep.
And so the thing about Bob Dylan is that what I like about music, especially from the 60s, and that's kind of like, I like is that you have a layered cake of enjoyment. You have a story of musicians, how they come together, how they make errors, and that's sort of like prepping, you know, the enjoyment, like a movie. It's not just music. You have a story about these musicians coming together. Then you have the instrumentation that you can get into and figure, oh, this guy's playing this, and that. Then you have the actual songs, and it just continues. It's just a beautiful, and at the root of it is music, and from there branches out all these things. There's stories behind it all, and it just makes it so exciting.
Yeah.
Um, Bob Dylan was, according to all accounts that we hear about, and you can, is that he was very aware of him creating performances, and the idea of becoming the villain is something that popped up in the 60s as well. A lot of people don't know this, but the idea of the person that you love to hate as a release, as a social experiment, was also tried and tested in the 60s.
Yeah.
And
Alice.
another guy that did that was Jim Morrison. So there's a lot of, so Bob Dylan is a very important character persona in this whole, pop culture rock and roll
And,
timeline.
and taking it one step further, Alice Cooper further capitalized on it, because Alice Cooper, in every stage performance he ever did, Alice Cooper was the villain. And the villain always gets it in the end. I mean, there are some Alice Cooper concerts where he, quote unquote, dies like 6 or 7 times. The villain always gets it, but he always loved playing the baddie.
Yeah.
And he loved playing the villain. And I don't know if you've ever seen Alice Cooper live,
No.
but his concerts are extravaganzas. They are stage shows. Lots of sets, lots of makeup, lots of everything. It's a performance. You're watching almost a rock opera every time you go to a concert. And he really hyped that up. He wanted to be the villain, but the villain always got it in the end. With him, it was good and evil, and good always won. And that's why he, quote unquote, died so many times in his concerts, and a lot of fun.
Yeah. So,
But
to for you guys that are listening, or at this point, we went through, what was it, our top 6?
our top 6, or our bottom 6, we should call them the 6 feet under. the your 3 and my 3 worst albums of all time.
My 3 were Bob Dylan live at Budokan. Even though I've said all this about Bob Dylan now, that album, like I mentioned before, it was live. First time I had purchased a live album. I didn't like the live environment sound, and I didn't like the fact that Dylan had changed up the way every song was. Yeah, it was a difficult one to go through, and yet I look fondly back on it. But it was one of my choices. Bob Dylan live at Budokan. Europe, The Final Countdown. Hated that one song, The Final Countdown, and the other one was, what was my other one? Sweating Bullets.
Megadeth, yeah.
Megadeth, yeah. Which was Countdown to Extinction. And your 3 were?
My 3 were Joan Jett and the Blackhearts. I love rock and roll, and that one kind of raised a little bit of ire out there.
Yeah.
And Grand Funk Railroad, All the Girls in the World Beware, and the soundtrack to the movie Saturday Night Fever.
Yeah, that one was also a controversial.
May the 3 of them rest in peace.
Yep. Last week we touched on 10 albums that were our top 10 albums. Mark did 5, I did 5, and that was in the previous episode. You could check it out on our website, trampledunderfootpodcast.com, and you can go under the tab that says
Wayback Machine. It's a big red link right in the center top of the page. Wayback Machine. You click on that, and you'll go back to all of our previous episodes, all the way back to episode 1, when we were young and more spry and all this was green fields.
That's right.
Yeah, trampledunderfootpodcast.com. Also, we have a Facebook page. You can look us up on Facebook, Trampled Underfoot Podcast. Say hello. Send us a message. Is anybody out there? Is this thing on? Okay.
Yeah, let us know what your thoughts are. If you have ideas, guys, let us know what your thoughts are so that we can test those out and do an episode with some of those ideas included. We don't promise anything, but we will be, reading and listening to your thoughts. So we'd appreciate it. Helps us out, helps all of us out, and we could explore new topics as we go.
Yeah.
So I think that what do you say? Wrap?
I think that's a wrap. What do you think?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks for hanging out with us, y'all. Really appreciate it. Have a good night.
Have a good night, everyone.